In this session on equity theory, let us see what motivates an individual at his or her workplace. In 1960s, John Adams introduced the idea that equity and fairness perceived by an individual at his workplace motivates the individual. These forms the basis of equity theory. If people feel fairly or advantageously treated, people are motivated to do their work. But if unfairly or disadvantageously treated, then disaffection arises, dissatisfaction and demotivation also results. Thus, Adams' equity theory focuses on the relationship exchange wherein individuals give something and get something in return. Now, to understand equity theory, we need to understand three terms. The three terms are inputs, outputs or outcomes, and reference person or reference group. Inputs. What the individual gives at his workplace are called inputs. For this contribution to his workplace, what he receives are called outputs or outcomes. Now, these outputs and inputs are to be seen from some reference point. So, the third term is called as reference person or reference group. Let us understand inputs and outputs in detail. Inputs are the individual's contribution at his workplace and that he perceives would entitle him for rewards or benefits. Outputs are the positive or negative consequences that an individual perceives that he has incurred as a result of his exchange relationship. Let us see and understand inputs and outputs in detail from the examples of inputs and outputs. Examples of inputs would be time put in, efforts given, loyalty, hard work, commitment, ability, adaptability, tolerance, determination, trust in superiors, skill, experience, and the like. Outputs or outcomes would be job security, esteem, salary, employee benefits, recognition, reputation, sense of achievement, responsibility, and praise. As can be seen from the figure, equity theory is about achieving balance between inputs and outputs, and that is measured against a reference point. Let us see what happens when inputs and outputs are not balanced. If inputs are less than outputs, then inequalities can arise. And if outputs are less than inputs, then too inequalities can arise. To understand the balance of ratios of input and output on the basis of which equality or inequality arises, let us understand what do O, I, A and P stand for. O stands for sum of all outputs, I stands for sum of all inputs, P represents the person, himself or herself, and A represents other person or persons. That is the reference group or person with whom the individual compares self with. Adams proposed that a state of equity exists only when the ratio of output to input of the person is equal to ratio of output to input of other person or group of persons may be. And a state of inequity results if the ratio of output to input of the person, himself or herself, is less than or more than output to input of other person or persons. Thus, inequity results not only when a person is under-benefited but also when he or she is over-benefited. An important issue of the equity theory is the emphasis on the individual's perception of what exists even though it may not be real. Let us see what happens when a person perceives inequalities or inequities at his workplace. Inequalities in outputs or rewards may result in lower levels of job satisfaction, loss of motivation, deviant workplace behavior, lower levels of employee satisfaction, which can affect performance at his workplace, and that could affect the entire organization. Equity theory proposed that when an individual perceives inequality at his workplace, the individual experiences a state of distress. This distressing state will move the individual to take action to restore the state of equity. The result of inequity is tension also. If an individual perceives deficit, then anger may result. But if an individual perceives that he receives more than others, then a feeling of guilt also may develop. The anger that results is usually directed towards other people or institution that is the cause of deficit, or at times it may be self-directed also. As seen earlier also, if the individual perceives equity at workplace, the individual feels motivated. But if the individual perceives inequality at workplace, distress is experienced by the individual, and the individual will try to restore equality through the use of equality restoration methods. The restoration of equality happens in two ways: actual restoration, and the other is psychological restoration. Actual restoration is making real changes to inputs or outputs. Actual restoration of equity refers to the behavior of the individuals who feel the inequity to work less, to demand a raise from their company, or destroy company equipments. Psychological restoration of equity refers to convincing oneself that inequitable relationship is somewhat equitable by distorting reality. The inequality restoration methods used by the individuals are change inputs, change outputs, alter perceptions of self, alter perceptions of others, change situation, change comparisons. Let us see the different equality restoration methods one by one. The first method, person altering his inputs. In case of felt inequity, the person may increase or decrease his inputs depending on whether the inequity is advantageous or disadvantageous. For example, if I feel my outputs are less than the other person's output, which may be in the form of salary or other monetary benefits, in spite of both of us putting in the same inputs, I may try to alter the inputs by putting in less number of hours and putting in less efforts. Similarly, if my outputs in the form of pension and other retirement benefits are more than the other person's output, which maybe the other person is not even entitled to, I will try and increase my educational qualifications or maybe even upgrade my ICT skills so that I restore the balance of inputs and outputs. Inputs in the form of education, skills, dedication, commitment, loyalty, hard work can be altered, but inputs in the form of gender, caste, race, which the person perceives as inputs, cannot be altered. Let us see the second inequality reduction method. Person altering his outputs. A person may change his outputs by either increasing or decreasing his outputs depending on whether the equity is advantageous or disadvantageous. For example, if I feel that my inputs are less than my colleague's inputs, which is in the form of time put in at the workplace, efforts put in spite of both of us receiving the same salary, I will decrease my output by not even bothering to ask for travel benefits which I am entitled to. Similarly, if I feel that my inputs are more than my colleagues' inputs, which is in the form of time spent at the workplace, my educational qualifications, then I will try to increase my output by convincing the management or my boss to give me a salary raise or other employment benefits so that I restore the balance of inputs and outputs. The third inequality reduction method. Person altering perceptions of self. A person may cognitively vary perceptions of self by convincing oneself that balance is achieved by distorting reality. For example, if I feel that my inputs in the form of efforts put in at the workplace are less than my colleagues' inputs, then I would convince myself that though I may put in less efforts, but I spend more time at my workplace, though not doing any productive work. The fourth inequality reduction method. Person altering perceptions of others. A person may cognitively vary his or her perceptions of others. For example, if I feel others' outputs in the form of salary is more than my outputs, then I would convince myself that others put in lot of hard work, give more time, show more commitment, and hence they deserve the higher pay package. The fifth inequality reduction method. Change situations. If a person who perceives inequity feels that he cannot alter inputs or outputs, change perceptions of self or others, the person may change the situation by quitting his job, changing his or her job, or remaining absent from his workplace, or remaining absent at workplace. The last inequality reduction method. Change comparisons. It is possible mentally to switch from one reference group or person to other while still physically remaining in the same exchange relationship. For example, to restore equality, I may change my reference group or person from my colleague to my relative who also puts in less hours at his workplace or gets paid less at his job. Thus, it is important that managers or bosses should work to eliminate or minimize inequalities, especially when outputs or rewards are being allocated. When a balance is achieved between inputs and outputs, the employees will be more satisfied and be willing to work towards higher levels of productivity. And with this, we come to the end of this session on equity theory and its applications. Thank you.